process. And I actually really like the estimation thing, because for whatever reason, people in this industry, they're very like prickly about money and numbers and such, and I don't think that we should be. But yes, I love that example, because it just goes, well, hey, look, I'm not here to actually gouge you for money. Like, if you can establish trust, if people can actually believe what you're saying because you are true in what you're saying, you're not just trying to squeeze the most out of them. And say, well, with regard to budget, for example, all I'm really trying to do is help understand the most value I can give you without breaking your budget. And the only way I can do that is if we have an honest conversation about that number. And so just tell me, is it north or south of X?
Right. Well, and I think it works in what the context you were talking about too, is that what if sometimes I never know a solution till I go over it in a way, right? Sure. Where I'm like, here's your solution. I'm going to throw this one that is way past that one at you and see what happens. Yeah. See if you chase after it, or if you're like, no, thank you, I'm staying right here.
So no, this is a really, really great place to interject something that I often use as a design exercise, but you can apply this to something like a budget. It's this idea of the anti-problem. And anybody who's read the book Game Storming by Dave Gray, very popular, right? Seminal book if you're doing any kind of meeting design.
Yeah, it's a must read.
Yeah, right. So the anti-problem, in short, is basically exploring the idea of what's the worst thing we can do to solve this problem. Like, if we were actually trying to do everything we could to not solve that problem, what's the worst idea? Because interestingly, and the way I describe this is, you find the edge of the cliff. That's where you fall off the cliff.
As a team, as a group.
You fail entirely.
Not just what you and your personal mind think.
Yep. We all agree that that's the cliff. That's where you fall off. Interestingly, you'll find that when you take maybe one step back from the cliff, all of a sudden you actually start having some pretty brilliant ideas. Right next to the cliff actually isn't failure. Some of the most insightful and brilliant ideas. And so even with regard to an estimate or budget, is you say, okay, well, what if this project costs you $3 million and somebody freaks out? They go, whoa, no way, that's at least 3 times our budget. Well, okay, so you're talking like 500, right? Like, it just narrows people. It's kind of asking like, what's the worst thing that could happen for you?
Well, when I was doing projects back in the day, I would do things like a pre-mortem sometimes with clients, and some people freaked out at the idea of it. Why are we talking about that? This has the potential of failure. Why did I hire you if this has a potential for failure? And that was a sobering discussion, because I totally, you're not wrong, but in the context of it. But this is a unique problem we're solving. This is a problem in your space, and the reason why you want to solve it is because it hasn't been really addressed before, not in this way. So that inherently will create some potential issues. It's just a natural thing. It's how the world works. Yeah. But people don't want to hear it. I used to do a risk register at the beginning of projects where I'd write down, these are all the risks and these are the ways that have to be addressed. Yeah. And I had a client come to me and say, I don't like risks register. I don't like this. And I'd be like, how about if I call it the gaps register? And they're like, okay, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Okay. So I have to react to that last point, because I actually make that specific point. I keep referencing this talk. There's a couple of things I'm like focusing pretty heavily on in our conversation that I didn't even intend to, but the talk that I give on selling your ideas, I use that. So I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan, have been since I was, knee high. So in the last Indiana Jones, Crystal Skull, which I'm not a huge fan of that one.
Not the boof? You don't like the boof?
The whole movie is not my favorite. Like the first half of it, the cinematography and the style was all great. And then the story fell apart, in my opinion. Whatever.
Then aliens.
Well, swinging through the forest on vines with monkeys was just like, that was not something that ever happened in the old. Whatever, it doesn't matter.
We'll save that for another show.
We probably shouldn't. Okay, whatever. There's a scene in that movie. Anybody who knows Indiana Jones knows he's terrified of snakes. He's falling through quicksand in this pit, right? And so, yes, Shia LaBeouf and Miriam, who her name escapes me, the actress right now. They find him and they go to help him. She's actually in the sand pit with him, quicksand pit, and they find a branch or some vines or something to pull her out. Then they find this giant snake to throw to Indiana Jones for him to come out, right? He's terrified of snakes. He's about to die. He's about to lose his life. And he says, go find something else. What do you mean? There's nothing else around. It's a jungle. What do you expect? And they both go, grab the snake. And he goes, stop calling it that. And, it's a snake. What do you want to call it? Because say, grab the rope. Grab the rope. And he grabs the snake, and they pull him out. The lesson I use to teach there is the fact that if your clients, if your stakeholders, if your team members, whoever it is, don't like snakes, then call it a rope. Why do you care? Especially as UX designers, we get so wrapped around the axle on what we call things where that doesn't matter at all in helping us progress toward this thing. But going back to the conversation that we had, you were talking about pre-mortem and all that stuff. That's brilliant. And this was another topic I did not expect to focus on. But by the way, that goes back to this idea of Stoic philosophy. It basically says, like, go through the mental exercise of the worst thing that can happen to you. All of your fears, when you address them head on mentally, like as a mental exercise, and say, yep, that thing happens to me. Then you ask yourself, then what? You find that I'd be willing to bet you 90% of those things aren't actually all that bad. So let's use an example. What's the worst thing that can happen to you? I'm going to go into this meeting. I'm going to suggest a different way. Then what? The stakeholder in the team says, no, I don't like that idea. So that was the worst. And then what? Nothing. You didn't get fired. You didn't get yelled at. You didn't get bent over the barrel and tarred and feathered, right? Then what? Well, nothing. Then you have an opportunity to email the decision maker and say, I'm still apprehensive about this. Can we have a conversation about it? What's the worst that can happen there? They ignore you or they say no. Then what? All of these things that we have perceived in our heads is like the ways things can die, the pre-mortem, right? Like by doing that actually only strengthens our decisions and our actions for the better, because we realize that these things actually aren't that big of a deal.
Yeah.
But the more we allow this mysticism to get created around them, the bigger debilitation it causes for us as teams. And then how do we want to solve that problem? You mentioned it earlier. Well, let's get more people in the meeting. Let's throw more money and resources at it. And that never solves that problem.
Yeah.
It makes it worse.
And you build foresight then, right?
Totally.
And so with that, it's a great segue. Let's talk about foresight, which I want to talk a bit more about Aurelius here as we were running out of time. So I want to talk and hear, tell me exactly what Aurelius is and what it does and what problem does it solve?
Yeah. So Aurelius is a user research and insights platform. It's for folks just like us, designers, product leaders, researchers. What Aurelius does in its essence is it helps you take all of your user research notes and customer feedback. You put that in Aurelius, tag it, organize it, sort it, make sense of it faster and easier than ever before. Because then what it helps you do is create key insights, these nuggets, these things you'll share with your team so that you can make better decisions about your designs, products, and features.
And so when you were designing this, obviously the audience is you.
I should hope so.
Right?
Yeah.
The audience is you. And so, but I've heard you say this before, and even years ago when we worked together, you're not the user, but you are because you came up with the idea. So how do you balance that when you're designing a tool like this, where you have to step away and say, I can't be the main decision maker here, but I do know it so well, right?
Yeah. Well, so no question that I was trying to solve my own problem. We were trying to solve our own problem, right? We didn't feel like people were using and applying what they knew about customers well enough in their everyday decisions. And that's actually still true today, regardless of us and other tools to try to help you do this. In other talks and stuff that I've given, I've discussed this idea of self-design, which is not mine. Jared Spool has brought this up before. And self-design espouses that you're designing for yourself. The solution is for yourself, and so it's pretty easy to arrive at a happy end. And that's true if you are the only person. So let's talk about that, right? Like I am absolutely the customer, but the way in which I do that work is slightly different than the way in which you figure out what you learned from interviews and usability testing or feedback from intercom messages, right? Which we help you organize and figure out all of that. Okay. So then, what happens is the advantage we have in being people who have that problem and are trying to solve that is we probably get past the first 80% a lot faster than you would. And here's a great example of that, right? Like I've worked on projects for lease management applications at Fortune 500 companies. I don't know squat about that. So I have to do a bunch of research to even get to the 80%. And then we're in pretty good shape, right? This just gives you an advantage where you say, I know roughly the first 80% of that. But in some cases, the last 20% is, is where the rubber meets the road, I guess, in some respects. And so, interestingly, as a quick side note, Aurelius version 1, I referenced it earlier in our conversation, was a much broader application, and we completely tore it down, redesigned, rebuilt the entire thing to focus on an even more specific problem through the process of doing that.
Because you did the version 1.
It's absolutely true. We would not have come to the understanding that we have today and the product and how we are serving designers, product managers, product leaders, researchers today if we had not done that. Mm-hmm. No question. Monday morning quarterback, I can look back and say, well, we built too much too soon. I tell people that today. I'm very free to admit that. But we would not have understood the focus we have now had we not done that. No question.
Yeah. So if I'm somebody who's a research professional, and how are people solving that problem already right now? What are they hiring in the jobs to be done sort of framework? What are they hiring right now to fix that?
Yeah.
That Aurelius can help them with?
Well, they're doing a couple things. First of all, so let's just take a look at the research process, right? So typically you go, well, what is it that we're trying to learn? You put together some goals for the research, and then you choose your method, interviews, usability
surveys.
Systems. Whatever. Surveys. Mm-hmm. Surveys is a popular one. Mm-hmm. And you say, here's the questions we're going to ask, and here's how we're going to get that information. And then you try to figure out what you learned from that information, hopefully. And then you're sharing that with somebody else because it's meant to impact or influence some decision, right? That's just what happens in the broad sense. So the ways people are doing that today are, they're writing emails to people.
Right.
They're creating spreadsheets to collect notes or Word documents or Google Docs or whatever that is. Most of the time, because we as human beings are not great at processing information, mm-hmm. they don't even do that synthesis, that analysis part that I mentioned, figuring out what you learned. Most of the time, unfortunately, and this is not what should happen, is what they're doing is they're just going, I remember these were the things that come to top of mind.
Yeah, it becomes anecdotal.
Well, but it's recall, right? Well, we did these 10 interviews. Maybe you and I did these 10 interviews, and here's the things we agree we remember being most important, but we didn't actually go through our notes in depth and figure out what we learned. And so then that's what we share.
Well, because you don't have the opportunity.
Exactly, because you don't have the time, because there's no tools to help you along with that. And then how you're sharing that, maybe you're making a PowerPoint presentation or another Word document, and you either go through that in a meeting with a bunch of people or you email it or whatever, and then what happens with it? You put it in Google Docs or you put it in SharePoint and it goes somewhere to die.
Right.
And you never look at it again. Now, your second part of that question is how does Aurelius help you do that? Well, a couple different ways. The first part is if you put everything that you're doing in Aurelius, right, taking all your research notes as you're doing the interviews, or you copy and paste all the free-form survey responses that nobody ever reads, and you dump that into Aurelius with our bulk input feature. Literally, I did, I think, 148 responses from a survey we did, and it got in there with tags that I added to it in 20 seconds. Mm-hmm. And then you can search by keyword and then actually group those things, add tags to that, create key insights. And all of a sudden, you get where I'm going with this, right? Everything's in one place because a machine can do that better and faster than you. And it helps you create more time to figure out what you learned faster. And then
sorting through the data.
Bingo. And then it actually allows you to take that stuff and you say, well, I searched for team. We have 20 notes about team. You can just sit there and look at those notes about team. Right there. It took you literally 2 seconds to do. Mm-hmm. And then you can select that stuff and you can say, here's an insight or a nugget or a finding, whatever you call it. Again, the names don't matter to me. It's called key insight in Aurelius, but then you create that and it just groups that data and you can say, here's the thing we learned about that. And then the beauty of that is we're unlimited users. So you just invite people in and you